how do we Ukrainians feel this situation? Correct me if I'm mistaken, if I'm not right. So this crisis is not because of war within Ukraine and Russia. It is because of war within the USA and Russia, between the democracy world and military empire. So, and the main question is NATO expansion. Putin is against it, but he says he will stand down if NATO prohibits Ukraine from joining alliance. This demand has been rejected. So let's speak about the compromise, what it should be.
Well, first, let me address perhaps the first part of your question. I do think that part of the conflict is about Ukraine, but it is true that there is a broader scope here to it. The problem, from what I understand, is that President Putin does not like that Ukraine has become a flourishing democracy with a very strong now democratic tradition. What is this disagreement or struggle with Russia about? I mean, I can't see into Mr. Putin's mind, but to me it seems that what this is about is that Ukraine is becoming a thriving Western-oriented democracy, and that is a threat to Mr. Putin. So Ukraine has a democratically elected government that passes power peacefully from one leader to another. It has strong civil society that is out there criticizing the government all the time and is allowed to do that. It has a strong press and freedom of press, where the press, again, can go out there, criticize the government, criticize other leaders freely. None of those things exist right now in Russia. And Mr. Putin seems to me sees it as a threat because Ukraine is moving west, is starting to integrate with the West. So it's true that this struggle is not just about Ukraine. I think it's about Ukraine's success in moving west, and evidently Mr. Putin's view that Ukraine doesn't have the independence to be able to do that. So then when we ask the question, well, what about these demands that Ukraine not be allowed to join NATO, not be allowed to join the EU? The fact is that simply isn't Russia's call about whether Ukraine joins NATO, EU, or any other organization. So ultimately, it's up to Ukraine and the Ukrainian people and the Ukrainian voters to decide which direction they want to go. And if they have chosen to take the direction of NATO membership or EU membership or Western integration, that's their call. And so what we're defending, of course, we're defending Ukraine, but we're also defending the idea that countries should be able to choose their own fate, to decide what organizations to join, to decide who their allies are. And this is something that is rooted in American philosophy. I mean, our own country was founded on the idea that we, the United States, wanted our own say. We didn't want to have to report back to some other country as a colony. So we fought for our independence and our freedom. Ukraine has done the same. It's fought for its independence and freedom, and we're going to continue to help Ukraine fight for that independence and freedom and that ability to choose whatever alliances it wants to choose.
How long?
That really, I mean, there's a lot of factors that go into that. Joining NATO or the EU or any of these Western organizations, it's not easy. It's a tough task. Ukraine has gone a long way towards membership. It has an annual national plan, which is something that Ukraine works on with NATO every single year to say, here are the exercises we're going to do, here's the engagement we're going to have. Ukraine recently became an enhanced opportunity partner for NATO. That allows even more integration into NATO with NATO systems, and also allows more exercises and other engagement. So Ukraine is making its way towards NATO. There's also some reforms that have to be done both in the military sector, but also in the special services and other sectors. So Ukraine is on its way, but it's not quite there yet. And I know it can be frustrating to have to work so hard for so long, but I think that ultimately the goal of Western integration is worth it. I think the Ukrainian people think think that that goal is worth it. And I would just encourage Ukraine to continue working, and it will make it to that goal. And while it's hard and difficult and takes a lot of steps and can be frustrating, I think ultimately it's worth it. There is no requirement in NATO that every issue within the country is solved in that way. In other words, the borders are solid, but it is a tradition that usually these things should be resolved before a country joins NATO. So, of course, we hope that there can be a reasonable solution found in Donbass, and that the Donbass crisis and Russia's aggression can be resolved so that Ukraine can join NATO without having to have some sort of conflict ongoing.
Alexei Danilov, the Secretary of Ukraine's National Security and Defense Council, says that the attempt to implement Minsk agreement could trigger internal unrest that would benefit Moscow and divide Ukraine more and more. The question is, do you think that Minsk agreement is still alive? And the second part of the same question, in what way could Minsk agreement be upgraded?
I would say the Minsk process is still alive. I mean, there are meetings regularly, and there are also now, I would say, reinvigorated Normandy format meetings that are the sort of political oversight of the Minsk process. It's still alive. The problem is there are three members of the Normandy format, France, Germany, and Ukraine, that want to make progress, that have put forward proposals for doing so, that have thought creatively about how they can make sure that all of the Minsk requirements are met and that Ukraine still retains its sovereignty. And then there's Russia that basically does not work in good faith to try to negotiate an acceptable solution in Minsk. So that's the problem. And unless Russia is willing to negotiate in good faith and to actually apply what it says in Minsk and not their faulty interpretation of what Minsk says, unless Russia is willing to do that, unfortunately, it's going to be very difficult to find a compromise.
Russia wants the Ukrainian politicians speak with those who are now in power in Donetsk. Do you think it is, it must be, do you think that we should speak with the terrorists in Donetsk?
Well, Russia is somehow now claiming it's not a party to Minsk, which I find a little bit puzzling since Russia signed both Minsk agreements. Of course, it's a party. So what Russia is trying to do is instead push Ukraine to deal only with the so-called separatists, Russian-backed separatists. That simply won't work. Why? Partly because, as we know, the Russian-backed separatists don't see any benefit in resolving the situation. They live a very nice life right now. They get a lot of money from Russia and elsewhere. And they would have less of a nice life if they had to reintegrate and become part of the rule of law that is in Ukraine. So it is, first of all, ridiculous for Russia to say it's not part of it's not a party to the agreement. Of course, it's a party. And then to try to force Ukraine to deal only with these so-called separatists, the Russian-backed separatists, would lead to nowhere. It would lead to a frozen conflict like we see now in Transnistria that will never be resolved. So Ukraine is not agreeing to do this because it is not in Ukraine's interest to negotiate with a group of, as you said, basically terrorists who do not want to resolve the problem. So really, it's up to the Normandy Four, our partners, France and Germany and Ukraine, to help to convince Russia that it needs to negotiate in good faith. It needs to accept that it's a party to the conflict and to the discussions, and then negotiate a solution that works for everybody.
But in general, it's up to us, to Ukrainians, to decide if we sit with the separatists, as you call them, at the common table, or if we don't sit with them, you see?
Russia is trying to create an alternate reality in which it somehow isn't a party to the conflict. And I think that Ukraine the OSCE, which is the other player in the Minsk agreement, and then the Normandy Four all agree that it cannot just be Ukraine and the so-called separatists at the table, that there have to be others, because otherwise it will never be resolved. It will become a frozen conflict like we've seen in Transnistria and elsewhere, and it won't solve the problem.
And now about sanctions. The Biden administration says it will be new sanctions if Russian military troops cross the borders of Ukraine. But if it is not military troops, but perhaps green, polite people, how could we say in the world that this is the act of aggression? So how could Ukraine prove the invasion?
First of all, hybrid warfare is still warfare. And all of these cyber attacks, or as you said, polite green men, this is all a form of warfare. The United States has said there will be consequences for aggressive action against Ukraine. And that includes aggressive action that is, not just military forces, but if large-scale attacks were to take place in the hybrid world, there would still be a price to pay. So I think that everybody is watching very closely now what's going on in Ukraine. I think that the international community has been sensitized to Russia's playbook, which is to try to spark or cause some sort of disruption or attack that then Russia would blame on Ukraine and use as a pretext for action. I think everybody now is well aware that that's what Russia does, and they're looking very closely at any sort of attempt at what we call a false flag operation, which is an operation that is somehow blamed on Ukraine that is actually caused by Russia. I therefore think it will be much harder for Russia to pull one of these false flag operations than they've done in the past. They know that if something happens, let's say some large-scale attack in Donbass, which is controlled, by the way, by Russia, not by Ukraine, and the Russians or the Russian-backed separatists try to blame it on Ukrainians, I think now the international community knows to be very skeptical of that and to look very closely before accepting any claim by Russia that somehow an attack was provoked by Ukraine.
And the last question is about the workers of American embassy. When they will come back to Ukraine?
Well, first of all, it's actually not the U.S. Embassy employees that have departed for the most part. It's the family members of employees. As you probably know, we have a very large embassy here in Ukraine, the third largest in Europe. And it's a very popular place. People love to come to Kyiv. It's a nice place to live. And so we have a large group of family members with a lot of children. So the reason the decision was taken to have the family members depart was just to be very prudent, to make sure that they could depart in an organized way on commercial airlines and be able to take their pets with them and, take all of their belongings with them. And that takes time. And so that's why we thought it was prudent to have the family members leave. We did allow embassy staff to leave if they wished, but most embassy staff did not decide to go. So we still have a very large embassy staff here doing all the work that we normally do. So our consular section, doing visas, passports, we haven't stopped any of them. And we will definitely continue to do those as long as possible.
I think that you will come to Ukraine more and more after finishing your mission here.
I love Ukraine.